In 1999, during restoration work on the Karnak Temple complex near Luxor, workers uncovered a sealed chamber behind a false wall in one of the lesser-studied secondary buildings. The chamber had apparently been sealed in antiquity with a mixture of plaster and sand. Inside, according to the initial report published by the Supreme Council of Antiquities, the workers found a series of stone pedestals and fragmentary copper fittings that defied immediate classification. The report was published in a limited circulation internal bulletin, not a peer-reviewed journal. I found a reference to it cited in a separate paper about storage technologies in ancient Egypt, published in 2004. When I attempted to locate the original bulletin, the institution that produced it, now reorganized under a different administrative structure, indicated that the archive in question had been digitized selectively. The specific bulletin was not among the digitized materials. The copper fittings from the chamber are reportedly held in a storage facility associated with the Luxor Museum. They have not, to my knowledge, been the subject of a published metallurgical analysis. I want to be fair to the mundane explanation here. Sealed chambers in Egyptian temples are not unusual. Votive deposits, foundation offerings, storage of ritual objects. The reasons to seal a room in an ancient religious complex are numerous and unexciting. The copper fittings could be liturgical tools that predate any available reference catalog and therefore simply resist immediate classification. That is entirely possible. What is also possible is that the phrase defied immediate classification in a report that was then selectively digitized and quietly filed describes something that someone at some level decided not to look at too closely. I cannot know which is true, but the pattern find, describe, file, do not follow up holds with unsettling consistency across sites, across decades, across institutions. Act 9. The institutions that look away. There is a particular kind of academic courage required to publish findings that challenge the dominant model. It is not the courage of physical danger, though in some parts of the world, working on contested archaeological sites carries real risks. It is the more insidious kind, the courage to risk marginalization, to have your methodology questioned, to be associated with the fringe, even if your evidence is rigorous and your conclusions are qualified. Several researchers I've traced through citations and correspondence, none of whom I'll name without their consent, made careers in adjacent fields after producing early work that touched on anomalous technology. One moved from archaeometallurgy into museum conservation. Another shifted from ancient Near Eastern studies to classical architecture. A third stopped publishing entirely for 12 years, returned with work in a completely different subfield, and gave as a reason in a brief published autobiographical note, a desire for simpler questions. Maybe that reflects nothing. Academic careers shift for 100 reasons. People tire of difficult problems and move on. The absence of a clear causal mechanism between inconvenient research and career redirection does not imply the connection is real. But I note that the same papers do not get cited forward. Koenig's 1938 paper appears in perhaps 40 subsequent publications over 80 years. The Antikythera mechanism, discovered just decades earlier, has been cited in thousands. The mechanism is celebrated. The battery is a footnote. When you ask archaeologists why the disparity exists, the standard answer is that the Antikythera mechanism's function is unambiguous and its sophistication is beyond reasonable dispute. The battery's function is contested. You can't build a story on contested ground, which is exactly the problem, because the contestation was never adequately resolved. It was simply abandoned. And once you stop contesting a finding, once you let the quiet win, it becomes settled by default, not by evidence. The object weighed 11 pounds. That's what stopped me. Not the cuneiform etched along its base, not the corroded copper terminal soldered with an alloy we couldn't fully identify in 1938. The weight, 11 pounds for something the size of a large jar. I found the original excavation report buried in a footnote, and I spent 3 weeks trying to understand why no one had followed up. We have been told a clear story about human technological development. It goes in one direction, upward. Slow accumulation, trial and error across millennia, each generation handing off its discoveries to the next. Stone to bronze to iron to steam to silicon. Tidy. Inevitable. Reassuring. The problem is the archaeological record does not always cooperate with that story. And when it doesn't, the anomalies have a habit of disappearing into storage facilities, reclassified, transferred, or simply not discussed again. That is what this is about. Let me be clear about what I'm doing here. I am not claiming ancient aliens built our cities. I'm not claiming a lost civilization with smartphones walked the earth before Noah's flood. What I am doing is following an evidence trail through excavation reports, museum accession logs, academic correspondence, and institutional archives, and asking why certain discoveries prompted sudden silence instead of sustained inquiry. The pattern that emerges is not comforting. Act 1. The weight of the object. On June 12, 1936, workers laying a new sewer line beneath the streets of Baghdad struck something hard at a depth of roughly 4 meters. The foreman called for a halt. What they pulled from the ground looked, at first, like a clay vessel. Reddish-brown ceramic, roughly 15 centimeters tall. But there was a copper cylinder inside it, an iron rod inserted through the cylinder's core, and residue that a later analysis suggested was consistent with an acidic electrolytic solution, grape juice, or possibly wine vinegar. Wilhelm Koenig, an Austrian archaeologist then working as director of the National Museum of Iraq, documented the find in a 1938 paper. His conclusion was measured, but it stopped a room. The object, he suggested, might have functioned as a galvanic cell. A battery, dated, based on the surrounding strata, to sometime between 250 BCE and 250 CE. The paper caused a brief sensation. Then it was absorbed into the category that academia reserves for inconvenient things. The contested object, the historical curiosity. The batteries, because there were more than one, a point we will return to, were catalogued, photographed, and filed. Investigation more or less ceased. The official consensus that eventually settled was this. The Baghdad battery may have been used for electroplating or ceremonial purposes. We cannot be certain, and the evidence for an actual electrical application remains speculative. That is fair. That is genuinely fair. Let me hold that fairness in one hand. And let me hold something else in the other. Act 2. The official story. The mainstream position on anomalous ancient technology is not dismissive, at least not when it is stated carefully. Archaeologists acknowledge that ancient civilizations were sophisticated. Rome had underfloor heating. Alexandria had mechanical automata. The Greeks invented an analog computing device, the Antikythera mechanism, that remained unmatched in complexity for over 1,000 years after the culture that built it collapsed. The official story is not that ancient people were primitive. The official story is that technological development was linear and isolated. Each innovation arose from available materials, available knowledge, available need. Nothing requires us to posit electricity in Mesopotamia, the argument goes, because nothing we have found proves that electricity was applied to a practical purpose there. What the official story requires, however, is a kind of selective attention to anomalies. It requires us to account for each strange finding individually, in isolation, never quite allowing the dots to connect. The Baghdad battery is explained. The Dendera reliefs, carvings in an Egyptian temple that some researchers interpret as depicting glass bulbs with electrical filaments, are explained. The Saqqara bird, the ancient Indian texts describing aerial vehicles, the vitrified hill forts of Scotland whose stones were melted at temperatures no conventional Iron Age fire should reach. Each of these receives its own narrow explanation, its own footnote, its own quiet shelf in the museum of the almost dismissed. What the official story does not do, cannot do, perhaps, is explain them together. Act 3. Let's start with the numbers. There are, at present, at least a dozen known objects in museum collections worldwide that have been classified as anomalous, but have not received sustained scientific investigation since their initial documentation. Let me be specific. The Baghdad battery is the most famous, but it is not alone. Koenig himself noted in his 1938 paper that he had identified several similar vessels in the collections of the Berlin and Baghdad museums, all of which bore the same configuration: ceramic exterior, copper cylinder, iron rod, acid traces. He estimated there were perhaps 10 to 15 such objects in known collections at the time of his writing. The current count of formally documented analogs, based on papers published through the late 1980s, is between 7 and 9. Some of the others Koenig referenced have no surviving record. Speaking of records, this is where things get uncomfortable. The National Museum of Iraq was looted in April of 2003. The initial official count suggested approximately 15,000 objects were missing. The final number, assessed by Interpol and UNESCO over the subsequent decade, was revised downward in some categories, and in others left deliberately open because nobody agreed on what had been there in the first place. The museum's electronic records were incomplete. The paper archives were partially destroyed. Some objects appeared in international auction catalogs within 18 months. Which brings me to a piece of correspondence I found not in Baghdad, but in a university archive in Munich. In a letter dated March 1939, an unnamed German researcher wrote to a colleague at the Prussian Academy of Sciences. The letter, sitting in an uncatalogued folder of miscellaneous academic correspondence, describes a follow-up visit to Baghdad to examine the battery objects Koenig had written about. The researcher notes that 2 of the objects Koenig had documented could no longer be located within the museum inventory. The museum director, the letter says, expressed puzzlement. They had simply not been registered after an inventory transfer in late 1937. The researcher ends the letter with a phrase I keep returning to: "It appears certain things do not like to be seen twice." The timing is almost theatrical. Act 4. Patterns in the plaster. Let me take you somewhere else entirely. 1,700 miles northwest and 2,000 years earlier. In 2006, archaeologists excavating a Bronze Age site near the Aegean coast of Turkey unearthed a workshop space. Among the debris, broken pottery, carbonized grain, animal bone, they found something that did not belong. A series of thin copper plates, each no larger than a playing card, each bearing a regular pattern of perforations. The holes were not decorative. They were too precise for that. Metallurgical analysis showed the plates had been heated to a specific and controlled temperature, maintained consistently enough that the oxidation patterns were uniform across all surfaces. The lead archaeologist published a brief note in a regional journal in 2008, noting the discovery and suggesting the plates required further analysis. That further analysis, as far as I have been able to determine, never appeared in print. I contacted the excavation team through the university in Istanbul affiliated with the dig. I received a polite reply explaining that the project had concluded and the materials had been transferred to the National Collection. When I asked which collection, the response took 6 weeks and directed me to a storage facility in Ankara. A follow-up inquiry to that facility received no reply. That's not bureaucratic friction. That's a pattern. Because consider what sits alongside this in the record. The Roman OP out-of-place artifact, problem has been quietly circulating in academic circles for longer than most people realize. In 1936, the same year the Baghdad battery was pulled from the ground in Iraq, a geode cracked open in California revealed what appeared to be the remnants of a ceramic and metallic cylinder consistent with a manufactured spark plug. The object became known as the Koso artifact. Initial analysis was inconclusive. Later analysis identified it almost certainly as a 1920s-era champion spark plug. Case closed, case filed, case mostly forgotten. But here's what matters: the impulse to close the case, the alacrity of the debunking. The Koso artifact received more sustained attention in the 2 years after its discovery than the Baghdad battery received in the 2 decades after Koenig's paper. The one that turned out to be prosaic got investigated. The one that kept raising questions got shelved. Maybe that tells us something. Maybe it tells us nothing. But the asymmetry itself is worth sitting with. Act 5. The architecture of omission. There is a building in Cairo that most tourists pass without knowing its purpose. It sits adjacent to the Egyptian Museum complex, set back from the main street, behind a wall that was repainted in 2014. It is a storage facility. Conservatively, it holds more than 160,000 objects, roughly 3 times what is on public display in the main museum. The majority of these objects have never been formally published. I want to be careful here. This is not unusual. Almost every major museum in the world holds more in storage than it displays. The backlog of unpublished material in global archaeological collections is one of the quiet crises of the field. Not because of conspiracy, but because cataloging is slow, funding is scarce, and there are only so many specialists. The Egyptian case is simply the most dramatic example of scale. But scale is the point. If you were to identify, say, 24 anomalous objects in global collections, objects that challenged conventional assumptions about the technological capabilities of pre-industrial civilizations, and if a significant fraction of those objects had been documented once and then not documented again, and if the institutions holding them were underfunded, understaffed, and inaccessible to independent researchers, would you be able to tell the difference between negligence and intent? I've asked that question to 3 archaeologists, 2 historians of science, and a retired curator at a major European institution. All 5 said some version of the same thing. Probably not. The mechanisms of institutional inertia and the mechanisms of institutional suppression produce identical outcomes, most of the time. Objects disappear into storage. Follow-up never happens. The absence of investigation is not evidence of investigation avoidance. I found that answer honest. I also found it insufficient. Act 6. The electric thread. Let me build the pattern more carefully because it deserves care. The Baghdad battery, if it functioned as a galvanic cell, would have produced roughly 1.1 volts at perhaps a fraction of a milliamp. That is not enough to power anything we would recognize as a device. It is, however, enough to electroplate a thin layer of gold or silver onto a metal surface. A process that, if practiced in antiquity, would explain something that has long puzzled metallurgists: the presence in several ancient artifact collections of objects bearing thin metallic coatings of inexplicably even distribution and inexplicably low thickness, inconsistent with any known ancient gilding technique. The German researcher Max Friesulzer, working in the 1970s, documented at least 14 such objects from various Middle Eastern and Mediterranean collections. His paper on the subject was published in a specialist journal with a print run of approximately 400 copies. I found a reference to it in a footnote. I found the footnote in a dissertation. I found the dissertation in an uncatalogued box in a university library in Switzerland. Friesulzer died in 1983. His research files were donated to an archive in Zurich, where they remain largely unexamined. The objects he documented are still in the collections he documented them from. None of them, as far as I can determine from current institutional databases, have been subject to further electrolytic analysis. Which brings me to something I found while researching something else entirely. In 1978, a team of German and Iraqi archaeologists working in the region of ancient Ctesiphon, the Sassanid capital, roughly 30 kilometers south of Baghdad, encountered what their field notes describe as a series of underground chambers accessible through a collapsed earthen ceiling. The chambers were apparently part of an older structure, possibly Parthian, that had been built over. Inside the chambers, the team documented several dozen ceramic vessels consistent in form with the objects Koenig had described 40 years earlier. The field notes, which I obtained through a research request to the Deutsches Archaeologisches Institut, describe the team's excitement. They describe initial measurements. They describe plans to return for systematic excavation. The next entry in the file is dated 11 months later. It notes that excavation of the site was discontinued due to administrative complications and site access difficulties. There is no further documentation. The file ends. The chambers, if they still exist, are located in a region that has experienced significant military activity since 2003. Whether they remain accessible or intact is unknown. Maybe I'm seeing patterns where none exist. But the files are real. The dates are real. The administrative silence is real. Act 7, what was possible? I want to spend a moment with the physics because the physics is underrated. A Parthian-era battery, copper cylinder iron rod configuration, filled with a modest acid solution, produces a predictable electrochemical reaction. Connect several such cells in series, arrange them like modern batteries wired together, and you begin to accumulate useful voltage. 12 batteries of the Baghdad type, wired in series, would produce somewhere around 13 to 14 volts. That is enough to decompose water. Enough to cause mild physiological effects. Enough to produce a visible glow in certain discharge scenarios if the right materials were available as terminals. None of this means ancient Mesopotamians had electric lighting. Let me be precise about that. What it means is that the physics does not forbid more sophisticated application. If the objects existed, and if they were understood, even empirically, even without formal electrochemical theory, then more complex configurations were not impossible. They were merely undocumented. And here is the thing about documentation. It is fragile. The Library of Alexandria is the famous example. The burning library, the lost knowledge, the catastrophe that set back human learning by centuries. But there were other libraries. The Great Library of Nineveh, assembled by the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal in the 7th century BCE, held tens of thousands of clay tablets. The building was destroyed in 612 BCE. We have recovered perhaps a third of what may have been there. The rest is rubble and silence. The library at Pergamon, the House of Wisdom in Baghdad, the temple libraries of ancient India, periodically destroyed by fire and conquest. What we know of ancient technology is what survived, not what existed. Those are not the same category. Act 8. The sealed rooms.